Hi, I'm Abba Shapiro, and today we're going to look at getting pro results with the raw develop filter. Now, the great thing about the raw develop filter is you can fix luminance issues, you can fix color cast issues, and even distortion you might get from the lens. We're going to start with this image, which is grossly overexposed, and by the time we're done, we're going to have this image here. And I'm going to work through this image so you can see how we can use the various sliders to get from an turn off my split screen and reset this back to the way it was when it came out of the camera. To do that, I'm simply going to go over here and delete this filter. So this is what your screen looks like when you first open your image. And if you go up to the Add Filter section, you can find the Raw Develop filter underneath the Essentials section if you're on a Mac, or alphabetically if you're on a Windows machine. Now, if you're not seeing Raw Develop, but just Develop, it's because the image that you opened is probably a JPEG or a TIFF or a PNG. It's not a raw camera image. However, many of the techniques I'm showing you will work with the Develop filter, just like they work with Raw Develop. Just a raw image has more data to recover, so a lot of times you can recover a horrible image like this one that I took to something that's a little bit better. So now that we've applied the filter, we're ready to start our work. The first thing I want to point out is the histogram. The histogram is a graphical representation of your image. And you'll notice that there's a lot of information over here on the right, and that means there's a lot of really bright pixels and not a lot of pixels to the left, and those would indicate darker pixels. Now, if you're not seeing your histogram, make sure that it's turned on, and you can simply do that by clicking this button right here. So if you don't see your histogram, click on that, it will turn yellow and you will see your histogram. The other thing I want to point out is there's 5 different states of the histogram. So this is a mix of your red, green, and blue colors. If I click on that, I can look at just the red channel, the green channel, the blue channel, or all of them combined, and this is just pure white, so it's just telling me luminance. I tend to like to work with this histogram because it also allows me to determine color cast. So once you have your histogram open, let's go ahead and step through what some of the sliders do and the workflow that I use when trying to fix an image. So the first thing I'm going to work with is my exposure. And I'm going to go down to the exposure slider and just move it to the left until the picture starts looking more normal. And you'll notice that the histogram is now becoming more centered so that I actually have an image that is properly exposed. Now the contrast slider basically says, do I want an image with high contrast? And let's take a look at what happens when I move the slider all the way over to the right. You'll notice I have a lot of information to the left, which is a lot of black pixels or dark pixels, and I have a lot of information to the far right, which indicates I have a lot of really bright pixels. So there's a pretty large dynamic range when I move my contrast slider to the right. If I move it all the way to the left, you'll notice that I don't have as much dynamic range. Looking at the histogram, you can see I'm not really taking advantage of my really dark black pixels. There's no richness to the image, and I don't really have anything that's bright. This is an example of a low contrast image. So generally what I like to do is if I start off with an image that has relatively good contrast, I'll leave the slider alone, but sometimes I like to punch it up a little bit because it just gives my image a little bit more pop. Now, the other slider you can use to fix contrast is actually at the bottom, and that's the clarity slider. What it does, it expands just the middle part of the dynamic range. So you'll notice that it looks sharper, and if you look at the histogram as I move this from the left side to the right and back again, only the middle part of the image is being adjusted. So that's what clarity is all about, and you get the perception of greater sharpness when working with that slider. So now I've worked with the luminance and I've worked with the contrast and the clarity to get my image close. But what I want to do now is I want to take full advantage of getting rich blacks and really bright whites and also dealing with my shadows and my highlights. And those are the next 4 sliders that I'm going to be working with. So the first thing I like to do when I'm working with these sliders is turn on my clipping indicators. So if you go up here, there's little triangles and you can click on them. I just clicked and changed the color of my histogram. Let me go back and switch that to the way I want. And then I'm going to click on a little triangle to the right. So now you'll notice that if I brighten my image, and I'm going to go back to that exposure slide. I'm going to bring it back to where it is. As I get overexposed where I'm losing any detail, it shows me red, and that means I'm blowing out and losing detail. So I never really want to see red in my image if it's too bright, and the same thing if it's too dark. If I bring it down, you can see blue showing up, and that indicates that the blacks are crushed and I'm losing any nuance or detail in my shadows. Let me bring this back to a nice even level, which is where I was before, and I'm going to start working with the next 4 sliders. And these kind of interact with each other. Usually what I like to do is take my black level and bring it down so I can just about hit where I'm starting to lose detail. And this is a subjective decision. If I wanted to, I could intentionally lose some of this detail for the sake of the rest of the image, but for this example, I'm going to bring it up so we have all the detail we want in our blacks. The next thing I'm going to work with is my white area. So I'm going to bring this to the right, just to the area where I'm starting to see a little bit of red. And I'm going to leave this on here for a moment because I want to show you how the shadow and the highlights slider affect your image. The whites and black are affecting the extreme edges of my image. Shadows and highlights affect inside that area. So if I go ahead and I open this image up, I pull up the luminance value of my shadows, I can start seeing more information in the hut's roof and in the wood in front. So I kind of like that. I'm seeing more detail, but as you can see, it also affects the clouds. I'm blowing out some of that area. So I'm going to take the highlights and I'm going to slide those to the left to bring back that detail. And as you can see, I now have a much richer image. So working with the black and white sliders as well as the shadows and highlight sliders, you can make sure that you get the dynamic range that you want and see all the nuance in the detail that you intended when you took the picture. So that's a quick look at fixing this image with these sliders. Now, the other thing you can do in the raw develop filter is you can adjust color cast, and there's several ways you can do this. Moving back to the top part of the filter, we have the white balance drop-down menu. And as you can see, you can adjust this for daylight, cloudy, shade. What this means is that there's different color temperatures depending on different times of the day and different quality of light, whether you're inside or outside. So the default is as shot, which is what the camera determined the color balance to be, or maybe how you set the color balance when you took the shot. Now, perhaps that was wrong. Maybe you accidentally had it set it for, say, tungsten, and it's really daylight. So you can very easily step through the different color temperature settings and see how that affects your image. So if I switch to daylight, my image looks more golden. And if I continue down to cloudy, we get even a little more yellow. And if I go down to, say, tungsten, it's going to really mess up my image. Now, you might stylistically like this, and that's great. But what it's doing is it's actually going to a preset of color temperatures, and you'll notice that these sliders over here are automatically readjusting based upon the default values of different temperatures of light. Let's go back to as shot and actually work with the sliders to redevelop the color temperature of this image. Now, I remember it being a lot more golden, so I'm going to go ahead and move the temperature slider to the right and bring out that golden value. And I can go ahead, if I want to, try maybe adding a little bit of red to the image. And if I add too much, it does look artificial. And of course, if I went the other way to green, it just looks horrible. So you don't have to always play or adjust every slider, but it's good practice while you're learning to work with the raw develop filter is just grab a slider and move it all the way to the left and move it all the way to the right to get a general feel for what that slider does. Now, if I wanted to make sure that the color was neutral, I could go ahead and use the eyedropper, and if I shot a grayscale card, I could go ahead and sample that and very quickly balance my image. Let's take a look at how bad my shot was when we started. So this is the after, and it's pretty close to what I want, and this is the before. I would have never thought I could get that much detail out of my image, and that's because I shot this raw, and there was detail in the file that I wouldn't have been able to pull out if I shot this just as a JPEG. The raw develop filter is one of the most powerful tools you can use to get your images started so you can ultimately get them to look the way you want them to look.